Helen and Frank built a new home from the bones of an old county jail. They did it with their own hands, their own money, and the quiet dignity the world had tried to strip from them. Their 3 sons, the men they had raised in a house filled with love and sawdust, sold that very house from under them, leaving them with nothing but a few boxes and the clothes on their backs. They thought their parents were finished, 2 old people to be discarded in a cheap motel. But they forgot about Grandpa's trust. A secret kept for a generation, a lifeline hidden in a dusty ledger, waiting for the darkest day. With that money, Helen and Frank didn't seek revenge. They didn't sue. They bought a ruin, a place of punishment and despair, and with wood and wire and unwavering resolve, they transformed it into a sanctuary. They built a fortress for the forgotten, a home for the discarded, and in doing so, they found a justice far more profound than any court could provide. Their sons expected them to fade away. Instead, they built a legacy on the foundations of their betrayal. But I need to take you back to the beginning, to the house on Chestnut Street, before the world came undone. The house was more Frank than it was a collection of wood and nails. He had framed it himself in the spring of 1976, the year their first son, Mark, was born. He remembered the smell of the raw lumber, the satisfying thud of the hammer, the way the sun baked his shoulders as he raised the first wall. Helen would bring him lemonade in a tall, sweating glass, her belly round with their future. She was a bookkeeper by trade, a woman who saw the world in columns of debits and credits. Everything had its place. Every number told a story. She had organized the project, sourcing materials, managing the shoestring budget, her ledgers as crisp and clean as the architectural drawings Frank had labored over. For 48 years, that house was their universe. It was the repository of their life together. The pencil marks on the doorjamb in the kitchen tracked the growth of Mark, then David, then Kevin. The scuff marks on the hardwood floor in the hall were from 1,000 tricycle races and wrestling matches. The faint, sweet smell of pipe tobacco still clung to the den, a ghost of Helen's father, who had lived with them in his final years. Frank's workshop in the garage was his sanctuary. It smelled of sawdust and oil and the metallic tang of old tools. Each hammer, each saw, each plane had a history. They were extensions of his hands, tools he had used to build not just their home, but a life. He had built the cribs his sons slept in, the dining table they ate at, the bookshelves that held their school awards. Helen's office was a small, sunlit room off the kitchen. Her desk was an old oak roll-top that Frank had restored for her on their 10th anniversary. Here, she had balanced the family checkbook to the penny, managed their investments with quiet prudence, and kept the records of their lives in meticulous order. It was from this room that she had paid for college educations, for cars, for weddings. It was a room of quiet power, the engine that kept the family running smoothly. They were in their 70s now. Frank's hands were gnarled with arthritis, but they still knew the feel of good wood. Helen's eyes needed glasses for the fine print, but she could still spot a misplaced decimal from across the room. They had built a good life, a simple life, founded on the principles of hard work, honesty, and taking care of your own. They had a pension, a small but healthy savings account, and the house. The house was the cornerstone, paid off for 2 decades. It was their fortress. It was their legacy. The trouble started subtly, as it so often does. It started with a conversation about estate planning. Mark, their eldest, brought it up. He was a real estate developer now, with a sharp suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He talked about probate and taxes and protecting their assets. "It's just to make things easier, Mom," he had said, spreading a sheaf of papers across the dining table Frank had built. "This way, if anything happens, we can manage things for you without a lot of legal red tape." David, the middle son, a manager at a mid-level insurance firm, nodded along. He was the complacent one, always content to follow Mark's lead. "It makes sense," he'd murmured, avoiding his parents' eyes. Kevin, the youngest, a part-time music teacher who always seemed to be struggling, just looked uncomfortable. He fidgeted with his fork, his gaze fixed on the familiar grain of the tabletop. Helen, the observer, felt a flicker of unease. The language in the documents was dense, full of legal jargon she didn't recognize. "I'd like to have our lawyer look at these," she said, her voice calm but firm. Mark's smile tightened a fraction. "Of course, but this is all standard stuff. Our lawyer, a top guy in estate law, drew it up. It's just a durable power of attorney. It just gives us the ability to act on your behalf if you're unable. The word hung in the air. Unable. It was a suggestion of frailty, of incompetence. Frank, a man who had built his own world with his hands, bristled. We're perfectly able, he said, his voice a low rumble. We know, Dad. Of course you are, Mark said smoothly. This is for the future. It's about being prepared. We're just trying to take care of you, the way you've always taken care of us. It was that line that did it. The appeal to their lifetime of sacrifice. The inversion of the parent-child role. They had spent their lives providing, protecting. It was what parents did. And now, their sons wanted to do the same for them. It felt right. It felt like the natural order of things. Against her better judgment, swayed by Frank's weary sigh and Kevin's pleading eyes, Helen had agreed. They had sat at their dining table, in the heart of the home they had built, and signed the papers. They signed away their fortress. 2 months passed. Life went on. Frank worked in his garden. Helen balanced the books. They talked to their sons on the phone. The conversations were shorter now, more perfunctory. Mark was always busy. David was always distracted. Kevin always sounded guilty. Then the letter came. It was a simple, stark, white envelope addressed to current occupant. Helen opened it at her desk. It was a formal notice. An eviction. The property at 42 Chestnut Street had been sold. The new owners required them to vacate the premises within 30 days. It didn't make sense. It was a mistake. A prank. She called the realty company listed on the letterhead. A brisk, impersonal voice confirmed it. The house had been sold 2 weeks prior. A cash offer, a quick closing. But that's impossible, Helen said, her voice trembling. We own this house. We never listed it. Our records show the sale was executed by the legal holders of the power of attorney for the property, the woman said, her tone bored. Mark, David, and Kevin Miller. The names hit her like a physical blow. She dropped the phone into its cradle. The sunlit room suddenly felt cold. The numbers on her ledger swam before her eyes. Debits and credits. Assets and liabilities. Betrayal. Frank found her there, staring at the wall, the eviction notice clutched in her hand. He read it. He didn't speak. He walked out of the room, through the house he had built, and went into his workshop. Helen heard a terrible, splintering crash. She ran to the garage. The birdhouse he had been carving, a delicate, intricate replica of their own home, lay in 100 pieces on the concrete floor. Frank was standing over it, his hands clenched, his shoulders shaking. That was the beginning of the end of their old life. They called Mark. He didn't answer. They called David. His wife said he was in a meeting. They called Kevin. He answered, his voice a choked whisper. I'm so sorry, he'd sobbed. Mark said it was for the best. He said you couldn't manage the upkeep anymore. He said the money would be put in a fund for your care. He said. He never finished the sentence. Helen hung up. The care fund. The final, bitter irony. Their own money, the equity of their life's work, doled out to them like an allowance. They tried to fight it. They went to the police. An officer, young enough to be their grandson, looked at the power of attorney document. He shrugged. Your signatures are on it, he said. It looks legal. This is a civil matter. You need to hire a lawyer. They went to a lawyer, a man from the local legal aid society. He was kind but pessimistic. They can do this, he said, his face grim. It's an ironclad power of attorney. We can try to fight it, claim you were misled, but it will be a long, expensive battle. And in the meantime, the eviction is legal. You have to be out in 30 days. 30 days to dismantle a life. 30 days to pack up 48 years of memories. Every object was a fresh wound. The rocking chair where Helen had nursed her babies. The toolbox Frank's father had given him. The photograph albums filled with smiling faces that now looked like strangers, like conspirators. The sons had arranged everything. A moving truck. A storage unit for what little they could take. And a reservation at a place called the Starlight Motel, out by the highway. On the last day, as the movers carried out the last of their boxes, a sleek black car pulled up. Mark got out. He didn't look at them. He walked through the empty house with the new owner, a man with a developer's cold eyes, pointing out features, talking about renovations. He was selling it all over again. Frank stood on the lawn, his face a mask of stone. Helen watched her son, her firstborn, walk through the hollow shell of their life without a flicker of emotion. He was a stranger. They were ghosts in their own front yard. The Starlight Motel was a place where hope went to die. The sign flickered, the S and the T dark. The air smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. Their room was on the ground floor, facing the parking lot. It had 2 double beds with thin, pilled blankets, a television bolted to the wall, and a small, rattling air conditioner that did little to stir the humid air. Mark had paid for the first month, an act of charity, or perhaps guilt. After that, they were on their own. They tried to access their savings account. The balance was nearly zero. A series of large withdrawals had been made over the past month, all signed for by Mark Miller, power of attorney. He had taken everything: the house, the savings, their dignity. They were 74 and 76 years old, with 2 suitcases, a few boxes of keepsakes, and less than $500 in cash between them. They were adrift, invisible. The days at the motel bled into one another, a gray, featureless expanse of time. Frank would sit in the plastic chair by the door, staring at the traffic on the highway, his big, capable hands lying useless in his lap. He didn't talk. He didn't eat much. The builder had lost his foundation. Helen tried to maintain a routine. She made the beds every morning. She wiped down the small bathroom sink. She tried to read, but the despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. She would lie awake at night, listening to the rumble of trucks, the sound of arguments from the next room, and the ragged, shallow breathing of her husband. This was their low point. This was the bottom. They were discarded. They were nothing. She thought of her sons. Mark, with his cold ambition. David, with his weak compliance. Kevin, with his useless remorse. They had looked at their parents and seen not people, but a burden, an asset to be liquidated. One afternoon, about 2 weeks into their stay at the motel, Helen couldn't stand the silence anymore. She needed a purpose, a problem to solve, a column to balance. She pulled out one of the few boxes they had kept with them, a box labeled Family Papers. It was filled with old report cards, birth certificates, yellowed newspaper clippings, and her father's things. Her father had been a quiet, shrewd man, a postal worker who had saved obsessively and invested wisely in small, local businesses. He had distrusted banks, and he had distrusted easy promises. Always have something tucked away, he used to tell her. Something nobody knows about. For the day the roof falls in. She sifted through his papers. Old stock certificates for companies that no longer existed. Deeds for land long since sold. And then she saw it, tucked inside a thick, leather-bound folder for a life insurance policy that had paid out decades ago. It wasn't a policy. It was a trust document. The paper was thick, the typewritten letters faded but clear. It was called the Providence Trust, established in 1958. Her grandfather's name was on it. Not her father's, her grandfather's. A man she barely remembered, a farmer with calloused hands and piercing blue eyes. She read the terms. It was an unusual instrument. The trust was funded with a one-time deposit of what was then a very significant sum. It was designed to lie dormant, invested in a portfolio of ultra-conservative, long-term government bonds. It could not be touched. It could not be borrowed against. It could not be dissolved. It was a financial fossil, waiting. The activation clause was what made her breath catch. The trust and all its accumulated value would become accessible to his direct heir, her father, and now her, only under a specific and dire set of circumstances. The claimant had to prove, through notarized documents, the involuntary loss of their primary residence and the depletion of more than 90% of their liquid assets. It was a rescue line cast across 60 years of history. A message in a bottle from a grandfather she never knew. It was a fund for the day the roof fell in. Her hands trembled as she did the math in her head. The initial investment, the decades of compounding interest on those slow, steady bonds. It wouldn't be a fortune by modern standards, but it would be something. It would be enough. She found the name of the trust company at the bottom of the document. A small, old-fashioned bank in the state capital. She looked at Frank, who was staring out the window, a ghost in a cheap motel room. A spark ignited in her chest. The bookkeeper had found a number that didn't add up. She had found a hidden asset. "Frank," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "I think I found something." He turned, his eyes dull. She held up the folder. "My grandfather." He tucked something away. It took a week. A week of phone calls, of finding a notary who would come to the motel, of faxing documents from the motel office. She sent them the eviction notice, the bank statements showing their depleted savings, a copy of the power of attorney. She documented their ruin with the same meticulous care she had once used to document their prosperity. On a Tuesday morning, a call came from a man at the trust company. His voice was warm, respectful. "Mrs. Miller," he said, "we've reviewed the documents. The terms of the Providence Trust have been met. The funds will be wired to an account of your choosing within 24 hours, he paused. Your grandfather was a very forward-thinking man. Helen asked the question, her heart pounding. How much is it? The current value, the man said, is $162,451.87. Helen closed her eyes. It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't enough to buy back their old life. But it was a foundation. It was a start. It was a weapon. She hung up the phone and looked at her husband. For the first time since they had left their home, she felt the flicker of something that was not despair. It was resolve. Frank saw the change in her face. The slump was gone from her shoulders. The fire was back in her eyes. What is it, Helen? It's enough, she said. It's enough to start over. His first instinct was to fight. We can hire a real lawyer now, he said, his voice raw. We can take them to court. We can get the house back. Helen shook her head. The thought of a long, ugly court battle with her own children made her feel sick. The thought of returning to that house, now tainted by betrayal, felt wrong. It was a mausoleum now, not a home. No, Frank, she said softly. We're not going back. We're going forward. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the small, scarred table in the motel room with a cup of lukewarm coffee and a laptop she had bought that afternoon. She wasn't looking for houses. She was looking for something else. An opportunity. A place that no one else wanted. A place where they could not be touched. She searched for commercial properties, foreclosures, condemned buildings. And then she found it. It was a county auction listing. A piece of surplus property. The old Blackwood County Jail. The picture was grainy. A two-story, brutalist concrete box, built in the 1950s. The windows were narrow slits. A chain-link fence topped with barbed wire surrounded a small, paved yard. It had been decommissioned for a decade, ever since the new regional correctional facility was built. It was listed as a teardown. The land was worth more than the building. The starting bid was $60,000. She looked at the grim, forbidding structure. She saw the peeling paint, the overgrown weeds, the air of utter desolation. But the bookkeeper in her saw something else. Solid construction, a sound roofline, institutional-grade plumbing and electrical, likely over-engineered and built to last. It was a place of punishment, but it was also a fortress. She woke Frank up. It was 3 a.m. She turned the laptop towards him. Look, she said. He stared at the screen, his face incredulous. Helen, that's a jail. It's a building, Frank, she said, her voice firm. It's made of concrete and steel. It's still standing. You taught me that. Look for the bones. He looked closer. He zoomed in on the photo. He saw the masonry, the straight lines, the lack of any visible cracks in the foundation. He saw a building designed to withstand anything. A building designed to keep people in, but one that could just as easily keep the world out. It's a ruin, he whispered, but the word lacked conviction. The builder in him was stirring. The part of him that understood foundations and load-bearing walls was intrigued. We could buy it outright, Helen said, her voice gaining momentum. No mortgage. No bank. We'd have $100,000 left for repairs. It's got a dozen rooms. Small rooms, but rooms. It's got a kitchen. It's got plumbing. It's ours, Frank. Something that no one can take from us. He looked from the grim photo on the screen to his wife's determined face. He saw the woman who had stood beside him as he raised the first wall of their house 48 years ago. He saw the bookkeeper who had stretched every dollar. He saw the survivor who had pulled them back from the brink. A long silence filled the sterile motel room, broken only by the rattle of the air conditioner. Frank reached out and closed the laptop. I'll need my tools, he said. The purchase was absurdly simple. They were the only bidders. For $62,000, they became the proud owners of a decommissioned county jail. The deed was in their names. Helen recorded it herself at the county clerk's office. An asset. Their asset. The first time they saw it in person, the reality of their decision settled in. It was worse than the picture. The air was thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and forgotten misery. The paint was peeling in long, leprous sheets. The front door, a slab of solid steel, groaned in protest as Frank put his shoulder to it. They stepped inside. The lobby was a small, tiled room with a thick pane of yellowed, bulletproof glass separating it from the main office. Beyond that, a heavy, barred door led to the cell block. Frank ran his hand along a concrete wall. It was cold, solid. He stamped his foot on the floor. No give, no weakness. Good bones, he murmured, more to himself than to Helen. They explored the building. The ground floor held the main cell block, 10 small cells, 5 on each side of a central corridor. Each cell was a concrete box with a steel bunk, a toilet, and a sink. Upstairs were administrative offices, an infirmary, and a larger room that had served as a common area. In the back was a large, institutional kitchen, all stainless steel and grease, and a laundry room with hulking, ancient machines. It was overwhelming. It was grim. It was a monument to human failure. But it was theirs. That first day, they did nothing but clean. They opened the windows, letting in fresh air for the first time in a decade. They swept away layers of dust and grime. With every stroke of the broom, Helen felt a layer of her own despair being swept away. This was an action. This was progress. Frank went to the storage unit and retrieved his tools. He held them in his hands, reacquainting himself with their weight, their balance. The builder had a project. He started with the essentials: water, power. He spent 2 days in the basement, a maze of thick pipes and conduits, tracing lines, checking valves. He found the main water shut off and, with a grunt of effort, turned it. He heard a distant groan, and then the sound of water filling the pipes. He went to the kitchen and turned a faucet. Brown, sludgy water sputtered out, then slowly, miraculously, it ran clear. He laughed. It was the first time Helen had heard him laugh in months. A short, rusty bark of a sound. A victory. The electricity was a bigger challenge. The main panel was a terrifying tangle of old wiring. But Frank was methodical. He had wired his own house. He understood the logic. He spent a week cleaning contacts, replacing fuses, and tracing circuits. One evening, he flipped the main breaker. A single, bare bulb in the hallway flickered, then held steady, casting a weak but defiant glow in the cavernous space. They stood in the hallway, bathed in the light of that one bulb. It felt like starting a fire in the darkness. The work was grueling. They were in their 70s. Their bodies ached, but every small success fueled them. Frank repaired the leaky roof, his movements slow but sure. Helen scrubbed floors until the tiles shone. They chose one of the upstairs offices as their own room, painting the grim, gray walls a cheerful yellow. They bought a mattress and a hot plate. They moved out of the Starlight Motel and into the jail. Frank needed supplies he didn't have: specialty plumbing fittings, a specific gauge of copper wire. He found an old hardware store on the other side of town, a place called Hobbs Hardware. It was a cluttered, wonderful place that smelled of metal and wood and fertilizer. Behind the counter was a man about Frank's age, with a wiry frame and sharp, intelligent eyes. His name tag read Earl Hobbs, prop. Frank laid out the old valve he needed to replace. "Looking for one of these," he said. Earl picked it up, weighed it in his hand. "Haven't seen one of these in 20 years, he said. "What are you working on?" "The old textile mill." "The old county jail?" Frank said. Earl's eyebrows shot up. "I thought they were tearing that place down." "We bought it," Frank said simply. Fixing it up, Earl looked at Frank. He saw the calluses on his hands. He saw the frankness in his eyes. He saw a tradesman. "A peer." "The hell you say," he breathed. He disappeared into the back of the store and returned a few minutes later, blowing dust off a small, heavy box. He had 2 of the valves Frank needed. As Frank paid, Earl leaned on the counter. "You're the folks from the paper, aren't you?" "The ones whose sons," he trailed off, looking embarrassed. The story had been a small item in the local news, a brief mention of the property sale and the subsequent fraud investigation that had been opened by the DA's office. Frank just nodded. Earl looked at the parts on the counter. He looked at Frank's determined face. He made a decision. "Look," he said, "you're going to need more than a couple of valves to get that place livable. You tell me what you need. I'll run you a tab. Pay me when you can. A professional courtesy." Frank was taken aback. We can pay." "I know you can," Earl said, waving a hand. "But cash flow is king on a big project." I know the look of a man who's good for it. You just get that place built." It was the first act of unconditional kindness they had received from a stranger. It wasn't charity. It was respect. A master of one trade recognizing the master of another. Frank walked out of that store with more than just plumbing parts. He walked out with a sense of belonging. He had found an ally. With Earl's help, the pace of the work picked up. He not only provided materials on credit, but he also provided knowledge. He knew which modern fittings could be adapted to the old pipes. He knew who to call to get the gas turned on. He became their first friend in this new life. The story of the old couple fixing up the jail began to spread through the town's grapevine. It was a curiosity, a piece of local gossip. Most people thought they were crazy, but some were intrigued. One day, the local pastor, a kind-faced man named Reverend Michael, showed up at their door. He had heard their story from one of his parishioners. He brought them a casserole and an offer of help. "We have a young woman in our congregation," he said, his voice gentle. "Her name is Sarah. She's pregnant. Her family, they put her out. She has nowhere to go. I know it's a lot to ask, but I see you have a lot of rooms here." Helen and Frank looked at each other. They had been focused on making a space for themselves. The idea of bringing someone else into their fragile new world was daunting. But they looked at the row of empty cells. Concrete boxes. But they were warm. They were dry. They were safe. "We have a room," Helen said. They spent 3 days turning one of the cells into a proper bedroom. Frank built a wooden frame around the steel bunk to make it look more like a real bed. Helen found a small, cheerful rug and curtains at a thrift store. They scrubbed the toilet and sink until they gleamed. It was small. It was Spartan, but it was clean and secure. Sarah arrived with a single duffel bag. She was 19, with fear in her eyes but a core of strength beneath it. She looked at the small, clean room, at the new mattress, at the curtains on the narrow window. She started to cry. "It's the first time I've felt safe in months," she whispered. Sarah's arrival was a turning point. The jail was no longer just their project. It was a home. Her youthful energy was a balm. She insisted on helping, her belly growing rounder by the day. She was a surprisingly good cook, taking over the institutional kitchen and turning out simple, delicious meals. She helped Helen organize supplies, her neat handwriting filling the pages of a new ledger. A new ecosystem was forming, a fragile, unlikely community of 3. 2 weeks later, Reverend Michael called again. He knew a young man, Leo. His parents had found out he was gay and had kicked him out of the house with nothing but the clothes on his back. He was sleeping in his car. "We have a room," Helen said again, without hesitation this time. Leo was quiet, withdrawn, and wary. He was barely 20. Frank, who had never known anyone who was openly gay, was gruff with him at first. But he saw the boy's strength, his willingness to work. He put a hammer in Leo's hand and started teaching him how to frame a wall. "Measure twice, cut once," Frank grunted. "Wood doesn't care who you love. It only cares if you're straight and true." Leo was a quick learner. He became Frank's shadow, his apprentice. The work gave him a purpose, a way to channel his anger and his grief. He began to smile. The sound of 2 hammers, one old and one young, echoed through the halls of the jail. Then came Mrs. Gable. She was a widow in her late 60s, a former neighbor of one of Earl's customers. She had lost her small house to a predatory reverse mortgage scam. She was proud and devastated. Earl sent her to them. "I can't pay rent," she said, her voice stiff with pride. "We don't charge rent," Helen said gently. "We all contribute what we can." Mrs. Gable was a gardener. She looked at the paved, barren prison yard, surrounded by its chain-link fence, and saw not a dead space, but a canvas. "I can make this grow," she said. With help from Leo and Frank, she broke up the asphalt. Earl donated bags of soil and seeds. Mrs. Gable, her hands deep in the dirt, began to coax life from the dead ground. First came sprouts of lettuce, then the sturdy stalks of tomatoes, then the bright yellow blossoms of squash. The prison yard began to transform into a vibrant garden. The jail was no longer a jail. It had a new name, one that started as a joke, but stuck. Frank, looking at the solid walls and the community forming within them, had called it the fort. The name fit. It was a place of defense, a sanctuary. They had a system now. Frank and Leo were the builders, slowly renovating the upstairs offices into more comfortable apartments. Helen and Sarah managed the household, the budget, the kitchen. Mrs. Gable ran the garden, which was beginning to produce enough vegetables to feed them all. They were a found family, stitched together from the cast-offs of the world. They ate dinner together every night at a long table Frank and Leo had built in the old common area. They shared stories. They argued. They laughed. The old jail was filled with the sounds of life. Helen, the bookkeeper, watched it all. She kept a new set of ledgers. Not of money, but of people, of supplies, of progress. She saw the debits of their past lives, the betrayals, the losses, being slowly balanced by the credits of this new one. The credit of a shared meal. The credit of a newly planted seed. The credit of a helping hand. But the outside world had not forgotten them. Or more accurately, their sons had not forgotten the money. The news of what their parents were doing had reached the sons, filtered through town gossip. David and Kevin felt a confusing mix of shame and relief. Their parents were housed. They were safe. It eased their guilt. Mark felt nothing but fury. He saw the trust money, his inheritance, in his mind, being squandered on a derelict building and a collection of strays. He saw his parents, who were supposed to be dependent and grateful, displaying a shocking and infuriating independence. Most of all, he worried about exposure. The ADA investigation into the house sale was still open, a sword hanging over his head. His parents, living quietly in a managed care facility, were pitiable victims. His parents, building a new life and a new community, were a threat. They were a narrative he couldn't control. He decided to put a stop to it. He couldn't use his own name, so he made a phone call, an anonymous tip to the county code enforcement office. He spoke of an old, unsafe industrial building, unpermitted construction, illegal zoning, a dozen people living in a condemned structure. He painted a picture of a dangerous, unsanitary fire trap run by two senile old people. A week later, a county vehicle pulled up outside the fort. A man in a crisp uniform, with a clipboard and a stern expression, tacked a large, orange notice to the steel front door. It was a condemnation order. The document was a litany of violations. Improper zoning for multifamily residential use. Unpermitted structural modifications. Lack of adequate fire suppression systems. Non-compliant electrical and plumbing. The list went on for 3 pages. They were given 30 days. 30 days to bring the entire building up to modern code, a task that would require tens of thousands of dollars and an army of licensed contractors. If they failed to comply, the county would seize the property and demolish it. The orange notice felt like a second eviction. The residents of the fort gathered in the common room, the festive paper notice a glaring wound on their door. The fragile peace was shattered. Despair, which had been held at bay for months, seeped back into the room. "It's over," Leo said, his voice hollow. "They're not going to let us stay." Sarah held her now swollen belly, her face pale with fear. Mrs. Gable just stared at her hands, as if she could already feel the dirt from her garden being scraped away. Frank took the notice from the door and read it, his face grim. He saw the mountain of work it represented. It was impossible. He was a carpenter, not a magician. He looked at Helen. Helen, the observer, read the notice not as a death sentence, but as a checklist. It was a list of problems, and problems had solutions. Her mind, the mind of a bookkeeper, began to break it down, line by line, item by item. "It's not over," she said, her voice cutting through the despair. "It's a list. We've been working from a list since we got here. This is just a new list." Her resolve was a steel rod in the center of the room. "We have 29 days, she announced. "We have some money left. We have hands. We will make a new plan." The community, which had been on the verge of splintering, rallied. Helen's quiet strength became their own. They were not victims. They were builders. They were survivors. They had a fortress to defend. The first call Helen made was to Earl Hobbs. She read him the list of violations. He listened patiently, letting out a low whistle. "That's a tough one, Helen," he said. "They're trying to bury you in paperwork." He was silent for a moment. "But it's not impossible. The plumbing and electrical, that's the killer. You need licensed guys to sign off. Let me make some calls. I know some old-timers. Retired, but their licenses are still active." The next day, 2 pickup trucks pulled up to the fort. One belonged to a retired electrician named Sal, the other to a retired plumber named Manny. Both were in their 70s, old friends of Earl's. They looked at the building, at the list, at Frank. Earl said you were a good man in a tight spot, Sal the electrician said, looking at Frank's work on the main panel. He wasn't wrong. This is clean work. Just not to the new code. They agreed to help. For a fraction of the normal cost. They, too, saw it not as a job, but as a cause. They were old tradesmen, pushed aside by a younger generation, and they recognized the fight. The fort became a hive of activity. The race against time had begun. Frank and Leo worked alongside Sal and Manny, pulling new wire, installing new breakers, fitting new pipes. The work was nonstop, from dawn until long after dusk. The pastor, Reverend Michael, put out a call to his congregation. Volunteers arrived with paintbrushes and rollers, sandwiches and coffee. They painted walls, scrubbed floors, and cleaned the yard. The town, which had once viewed the fort as a strange curiosity, began to see it as a symbol of defiance. Donations of lumber, of drywall, of furniture began to appear at their door. Helen, meanwhile, had made another call. To her niece, Jessica, her sister's daughter, a sharp, driven young woman who had become an assistant district attorney in the county seat. They hadn't spoken in years, a casualty of benign family neglect. Jessica listened to the whole story on the phone. The house, the sons, the motel, the jail, the condemnation notice. She was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold with fury. They did what? She said. Aunt Helen, the fraud case against them is still open, but it's been sitting on a desk, low priority. This changes things. The condemnation notice, the timing is too perfect. This is witness intimidation. 2 days later, Jessica showed up at the fort. She saw the community working together, the sense of shared purpose. She hugged her aunt, a woman she suddenly realized she barely knew. I'm going to help you, Jessica said, her voice fierce. Legally. I'm going to look into this code enforcement officer. I'm going to look into the anonymous tip. And I am going to accelerate the case against Mark, David, and Kevin. She also gave Helen a crucial piece of advice. Document everything, she said. Every receipt, every hour of volunteer labor, every permit. Create an undeniable record of compliance. When the inspector comes, you hand him a binder that's thicker than his entire rulebook. This was a language Helen understood. She became the commander of the paper trail. She created a binder, a masterpiece of organization, with tabs for electrical, plumbing, fire safety, structural. Every receipt was logged. Every volunteer signed in and out. She was building a case for their existence. If you've made it this far, you're not just a viewer. You're a witness to the power of resilience. If you believe in second chances and the strength of community, hit that subscribe button and join ours. And let me know in the comments, what would you have done with the trust money? Would you have fought for the old house or built something new? Midway through the 3rd week, with just over a week to go until the inspection, a luxury sedan pulled up outside. Mark got out. He had come to see the fruits of his labor, to witness their failure. He expected to find a derelict squat, a handful of defeated people waiting for the bulldozers. Instead, he found a construction site humming with purposeful activity. He saw new windows being installed. He heard the buzz of power saws and the sound of laughter. He saw his father, Frank, directing a group of volunteers, looking 10 years younger, his back straight, his voice firm. He saw the garden, vibrant and green, in the old prison yard. A young pregnant woman and an older woman were tending to tomato plants. He strode to the front door, his face a thundercloud. Helen met him there. She was not the broken, weeping woman he had left at the motel. She stood straight, her eyes clear and cold. She did not invite him in. What is this circus? He demanded, gesturing at the activity around them. What have you done? You've wasted all that money on this dump, and these freeloaders. We built a home, Helen said, her voice level. It was the simple truth, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. You're senile, he sneered, his voice rising. That was my money. My inheritance. You had no right. Helen looked at her firstborn son, the baby she had rocked in the chair Frank had built, the boy whose growth she had tracked on the doorjamb. She felt a profound and terrible pity for him. He saw the world only in terms of debits. He had no column for love, or for community, or for dignity. The Providence Trust was established by my grandfather, she said, her bookkeeper's voice precise and devoid of emotion. It was his money. Now it is our money. The house on Chestnut Street, The equity from which you stole to the amount of $482,000. That was our money. The savings account you drained, totaling $63,000. That was our money. She was reciting facts from a ledger. Her niece, the ADA, had given her the exact figures from the investigation. Under State Penal Code 368, she continued, her voice unwavering, what you did constitutes felony elder abuse. Under Penal Code 487, it is grand theft. The anonymous, malicious complaint you filed with code enforcement, which my niece, the assistant district attorney, has traced back to a burner phone purchased near your office, could be considered witness tampering. Mark's face went pale. The sneer dissolved into shock, then fear. This was not the mother he knew. This was a stranger, a woman made of ice and numbers. You wouldn't, he whispered. I am not the one prosecuting you, Mark, Helen said. The state is. You made a series of choices. Now those choices have consequences, she paused, looking past him to the community working behind her. We made a choice, too. We chose to build, not to break. Now, I have to get back to work. Please leave our property. She closed the steel door in his face, the sound echoing with finality. She leaned against it for a moment, her heart pounding. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was necessary. She had balanced the account. The final week was a blur of frantic work. Sal and Manny signed off on the last of the plumbing and electrical work, their official seals stamped on the permits. Frank and Leo installed the final fire door. The volunteers finished the last coat of paint. On the final day, the day before the inspection, Helen assembled the binder. It was 6 inches thick, a testament to 30 days of unrelenting effort. It contained every permit, every receipt, a detailed log of every hour of labor, and photographs documenting every stage of the renovation. That night, no one slept. They cleaned. They tidied. They walked through the halls of the fort, their home, wondering if it would still be theirs tomorrow. The morning of the inspection was bright and clear. At precisely 9 a.m., the same county vehicle pulled up. The same stern-faced inspector, a Mr. Davies, got out, his clipboard in hand. He had the air of a man expecting to confirm a condemnation. Helen and Frank met him at the door. Good morning, Mr. Davies, Helen said politely. We've been expecting you. Please, come in. They handed him the binder. He took it, surprised by its weight. He opened it, his eyebrows rising as he saw the neatly organized tabs, the official permits, the sheer volume of documentation. Frank led the tour. He didn't make excuses. He didn't plead. He was a builder showing his work. He started in the basement, showing the new plumbing, the clearly labeled pipes. He moved to the electrical panel, showing the new wiring, the new breakers, all neatly installed. Mr. Davies was silent, making notes on his clipboard. His expression was unreadable. They went through the building, room by room. He checked the smoke detectors. He inspected the fire extinguishers. He noted the clearly marked exit signs. He saw that the small cell rooms had been converted, but not structurally altered. He saw the new kitchen, scrubbed clean, with its fire suppression hood inspected and certified. He saw the residence. He saw Sarah, heavily pregnant, arranging flowers on the dining table. He saw Leo, cleaning paintbrushes at a utility sink. He saw Mrs. Gable, coming in from the garden with a basket of fresh greens. They were not squatters. They were people in a home. The last stop on the tour was the yard. Mr. Davies stepped out into the sunshine and stopped. He stared at the garden. He saw the rows of vegetables, the bright splashes of marigolds, the small, neatly kept compost bin. He saw a place of life and cultivation where there had once been only cracked asphalt and despair. He stood there for a long time, looking at the garden, then back at the solid, clean building. He looked at Frank's calloused hands and Helen's steady gaze. He closed his clipboard. The anonymous complaint, he said, his voice softer now, described this place as a dangerous, unsanitary slum run by incompetents. He looked around again. They were wrong. He opened his clipboard again, took out a pen, and began to sign off on the inspection form. Check, check, check. You've met the requirements, he said formally. But you've done more than that. He looked at Helen. This isn't a jail anymore. And it's not just a multi-unit dwelling. I don't know what the right word is for it. We call it the fort, Helen said quietly. Mr. Davies nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. I'm signing off on a residential variance, he said. Given the unique circumstances and the clear benefit to the community, you're fully compliant. The condemnation order is rescinded. He handed the signed paperwork to Helen. It was their certificate of existence, their victory. A cheer went up from the residents who had been watching from the windows. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Frank clasped Mr. Davies's hand, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. Don't thank me," the inspector said, looking at the binder Helen was holding. "You did the work." As Mr. Davies drove away, another car was pulling up. A dark, unmarked sedan. Two plainclothes detectives got out, along with Jessica, the ADA. She had a grimly satisfied look on her face. The timing was not a coincidence. She had waited for the inspection to be complete. The news broke the next day. The arrests of Mark, David, and Kevin Miller made the front page of the local paper. The charges were fraud, grand theft, and felony elder abuse. The article told the whole story, contrasting the son's greed with the parents' incredible act of resilience. The headline read, "Sons defraud elderly parents. Couple builds sanctuary from abandoned jail." The story of the fort became a local legend, a symbol of hope. The legal consequences for the sons were swift. Faced with the mountain of evidence Jessica had compiled, David and Kevin accepted a plea deal. They confessed, expressed their remorse, and agreed to testify against their brother. Their cooperation and their clear contrition earned them lesser sentences, probation, community service, and a court-ordered restitution plan that would garnish their wages for years to come. Mark fought the charges. He hired an expensive lawyer and tried to paint his parents as senile and incompetent. But the jury saw the truth. They saw the binder Helen had compiled. They heard the testimony of his brothers. They saw the pictures of the fort, a thriving community built from nothing. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 7 years in a state prison. Not a decommissioned jail filled with hope, but a real one. Life at the fort settled into a new normal, a peaceful, productive rhythm. With their legal status secure, they were able to grow. The pastor and other community leaders referred more people to them. An elderly man who had lost his pension, a young woman escaping an abusive relationship, a teenager aged out of the foster care system. For each new resident, a room was prepared. A cell was transformed into a home. The rules were simple. Contribute what you can, respect your neighbors, help keep the place safe. The garden expanded. Mrs. Gable, with a crew of helpers, took over the entire yard. They sold their surplus vegetables at a local farmer's market, generating a small but steady income for the fort's operating expenses. Leo, under Frank's tutelage, had become a skilled carpenter. He started a small workshop in one of the old storage rooms, doing repairs and small furniture projects for people in town. His work was good, and his confidence grew with every completed job. Sarah gave birth to a healthy baby girl, Lily. The baby became the heart of the fort, doted on by a dozen surrogate grandparents. Her laughter echoed in halls that had only ever known silence and despair. Months passed. The seasons turned. The fort thrived, a small, self-sustaining ecosystem of healing and hard work. One autumn afternoon, a man appeared at the gate. He was thinner than Helen remembered, and his face was etched with shame. It was David, her middle son. He had served his probation. He just stood there, his hands shoved in his pockets, unable to meet her eyes. Frank was on the front steps, sanding a piece of wood for a new porch he was building. He stopped his work and watched his son. He didn't say a word. Helen came to the door. She looked at David, at his downcast eyes, at the way his shoulders were slumped in defeat. She thought of Mark, unrepentant in prison. She thought of Kevin, who sent long, rambling letters of apology every week. And she looked at David, who had come in person, to stand before them and accept their judgment. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say, "I forgive you." The wound was too deep for such easy words. Instead, she looked at him, her son, and said the only thing that mattered. The doors opened, David. He looked up, his eyes filled with tears. He walked slowly through the gate and up the steps. He looked at the piece of wood in his father's hands. Can I help?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Frank looked at his son's hands, soft and uncalloused. He looked at his face, stripped of its complacency. He handed him a piece of sandpaper. "Start with this," he said. It was not forgiveness. It was a beginning, a long, slow path to mending what had been broken. David began coming every weekend, working alongside his father, speaking little, just doing the work. He was learning to build again. Another year passed. The porch was finished, a wide, welcoming structure on the front of the forbidding concrete building. It was where the residents gathered on warm evenings. Helen and Frank sat there now, in two rocking chairs Frank and Leo had built. It was late afternoon, and the low sun cast a golden light over the garden. They watched the life of the home they had made. Mrs. Gable was showing a new resident how to prune tomato plants. Sarah's daughter, Lily, was taking her first wobbly steps on the grass, her mother watching with a smile. David was quietly oiling the new porch railing, his movements careful and practiced. On the wall of the old jail, next to the front door, Frank had mounted a small, intricately carved birdhouse. It was a perfect miniature of their old house on Chestnut Street, rebuilt from memory. As they watched, a small sparrow flew down and disappeared inside. Frank reached over and took Helen's hand. His hand was still rough and calloused. Hers was still slender and steady. 49 years of holding that hand. Through building a home, through raising a family, through betrayal, and through resurrection. She followed his gaze to the birdhouse, then to the thriving garden, then to the faces of their new family, their found family. The bookkeeper in her took a final accounting. The loss had been catastrophic. The pain, immeasurable. But the final balance was in the black. They had created something from the ruins. Something strong. Something good. Frank squeezed her hand. He looked at the little birdhouse, a memory of a life that was gone, and then at the solid, sprawling building behind them, the foundation of a life that was real. It was a good house,